The property market. If you bought a house in Sydney today, you'll pay $850 more than if you'd bought it yesterday. You wait a fortnight, you've got to find an extra $12,000, give or take. In Melbourne, your dream home costs $480 more tomorrow than it did today. And if you wait until AFL Grand Final day to pull the trigger on that dream home, your mortgage is going to be $7,000 bigger. In the last 12 months, the average house in Sydney has jumped by a dream-shattering $310,000, and if you're in Melbourne, $185,000. That's just in the past 12 months, the increase. We've got house prices currently growing at the fastest pace in 32 years. What about wages? Well, you tell me. You know that side of the equation. Have you had a jump in wage, 10, 20, 30%? Have you managed to save $800 a day after tax? We are up to our necks in a housing affordability crisis. But truth is, we've actually been in one for half a century. Gough Whitlam's government was the first of so many attempts to solve the problem of housing affordability. And the issue is again being put under the microscope this week by yet another parliamentary inquiry. This one will be chaired by Jason Falinski, and it all kicks off tomorrow. Now, Falinski's saying home ownership rates for under 40s are at the lowest level since 1947. And that's as far back as the data goes. He calls it a generational betrayal. Now, you'd probably share his concern like I do. It's outrageous. But can you guess how many submissions were made to this inquiry? This outrageous topic, things that make our blood boil. How many submissions do you reckon got lodged? 9. That's it. That was it. One of those 9 submissions was from a long-time campaigner for housing reform, economist Saul Eslake. Now, Saul has worked across the public and private sectors in a very lengthy career. He's now Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Tasmania. I'm delighted to welcome him back to Money News. Saul Eslake, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's good to be here, Brooke.
Well, I mean, governments dating back to Gough Whitlam have tried to solve the housing affordability crisis. How many inquiries do you reckon you've encountered in your time?
I would say at least half a dozen, and I haven't engaged with every inquiry that there would have been in the last 20 years. And indeed, although from the statement you just read out from Jason Falinski, it sounds like this one is starting out on the right track, my experience to date has been that none of these inquiries, no matter how good their recommendations have been, and some of them have been very good, has made any difference to the direction of housing policy that has really been pretty much the same for almost 60 years now.
So the same for 60 years, and what are the characteristics of that housing policy that leave us in the situation we have?
Well, I think in order to understand that, it's important to go back even earlier in time, about the end of the Second World War, until the early 1970s. Australia's population grew at a faster rate in percentage terms than it has done in the last 25 years, for example. And in addition to a large number of people migrating to Australia and a large number of Australians being born and growing up in Australia, we also saw a relatively much bigger movement from rural and regional areas into our 5 largest capital cities than we have seen in the last 20 years, although we've certainly seen that as well. And the surprising thing from today's perspective is that despite that very rapid growth in the demand for housing in particular our 5 biggest capital cities, the ratio of incomes to house prices, as far as we can tell from the data we have for this period, stayed pretty constant at about 3 times average weekly earnings. And during that period, the home ownership rate rose from about 52% at the census of 1947 to a peak of just over 72% at the census of 1966, and was still above 70% 10 years later at the census of 1976. And from today's standpoint, you sort of have to ask, well, how did we manage to do that? How did we manage to keep the price of housing stable relative to income so that the proportion of the population who owned their own home could rise by 20 percentage points in less than 20 years? And the answer is that during that period, governments, federal, state and local, Labor and Liberal, focused for the most part on boosting the supply of housing. either by building a lot of houses themselves through state housing authorities and the Defence Service Homes Scheme, and governments did very little other than running a big immigration program further to boost the demand for housing. Governments also did a lot, particularly at the state and local level, to facilitate the building of new housing by the private sector, including opening up land for suburban development, building public transport and arterial roads to connect those new housing estates with the inner parts of capital cities so that people could go to work, and not imposing unduly restrictive zoning and planning requirements that made it more difficult to build in established areas at higher densities.
Okay, so when did it start to turn? When did it all start to sour?
I'd say that the rot began to set in 1964, when the Menzies government introduced the first home savings grant scheme, as it was called, at the behest of John Howard, who the year before had been president of the New South Wales Young Liberals and persuaded Sir Robert Menzies to include the promise of a home savings grant in the election campaign of that year. And beginning at that time, government policy, federal, state and local, Labor and Liberal, has gradually pivoted from boosting the supply of housing, as it did for 20 or so years after the end of World War II, to increasingly inflating the demand for housing by giving people more money to buy housing, and particularly after 1999, making it an increasingly tax-effective strategy to borrow money in order to buy housing for investment purposes, whilst at the same time state and local governments moved increasingly away from boosting the supply of housing, instead to constraining the supply of housing by, for example, reducing the amount they spend on social housing, by making zoning and planning laws increasingly onerous, by making it more difficult to develop existing areas at higher densities to respond to changes in the way that people wanted to live, and by seeing the supply chain for the creation of new housing, from the development of land on the urban fringe to putting in roads and sewerage and drainage and all of that sort of thing, carving it up into residential blocks, to see that as providing multiple opportunities to impose new taxes and charges, which in turn get passed on ultimately to the people who buy houses in the form of higher prices for new housing. And so, if you, over a period as long as 50 years, start doing things that inflate the demand for housing while simultaneously constraining the supply of it, you don't sort of really need a PhD in economics to figure out what's going to happen to prices.
I mean, it's an excellent history lesson, which tells us exactly what the problem is, very clearly identified. But the problem here is politics then, isn't it? I mean, it's a complete waste of time and energy to do another inquiry, isn't it, when we know exactly what the problems are. The only solution is that it involves a politician taking to an election a policy that will probably lower house prices, and no one's going to do that.
Well, that's right. I mean, politicians of all political persuasions shed a lot of what I call crocodile tears over the difficulties that young people face in their first steps on the property ladder. But while they do shed those crocodile tears, deep in their hearts they know that in any given year there are on average about 100,000 people who succeed in becoming first home buyers. Last year there were rather more than that, and previous years there have been less than that, but on average it's about 100,000. And those 100,000 plus, maybe twice as many again who would like to have been homeowners but somehow aren't able to make it, they would like governments to do things that stop house prices going up. But as soon as they succeed in becoming homeowners, if they do, they join the 11 million Australians who already own one house. Within that 11 million, there are at least 2 million who own two or more properties, often as investments. And the last thing those 11 million Australians want politicians to do is anything that stops house prices going up at the fastest rate possible. And so, on the one hand, maybe 100,000, maybe 250,000 people at any point in time who'd like the government to stop house prices going up as rapidly as they have. On the other hand, 11 million people who want the government to keep prices going up rapidly. Even the dumbest of our politicians can, as the Americans say, do that math, and they do whenever we're confronted with a problem like this.
Saul, should young people accept that the affordability issue will never be solved then?
Well, I wonder sometimes, Brooke, why there isn't more anger among younger people at the way in which the housing system has been rigged by their parents' generation against them. You know, why there aren't more people out in the streets sort of chanting, what do we want like cheaper housing? When do we want it like now? Because most people under the age of 35 couldn't say 20 words without four of them being like. But, you know, instead it would seem that rather than protesting and demanding change, they take their revenge out on their parents' generation by refusing to move out of their homes and expecting their laundry done and their meals cooked and a blind eye turned to whoever accompanies them to breakfast in the morning. And maybe at some point when baby boomer parents who've been wanting to downsize or tree change or sea change and haven't been able to do it because their 40-year-old daughter is still living at home or their 38-year-old son, maybe then perhaps there will be some change. Maybe if young people did get as worked up about this as some of them, you know, for very good reasons, do about climate change or other issues that are of global rather than just simply Australian significance, maybe there will be some change. But for as long as people vote in a way that tells politicians that most Australians want housing prices to keep going up year after year, that's what politicians are going to deliver, and they have.
Well, this sounds like a problem much bigger than Jason Falinski, I've got to say. Saul Eslake, thank you so much. You're one of our preeminent economists in this country. Thank you for your time on Money News.
Yeah, that's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.